November 1st, 1950, a warm autumn afternoon in Washington, D.C. The temperature had climbed to an unusual 85 degrees, and tourists strolled along Pennsylvania Avenue, admiring the historic buildings that lined America's most famous street. Among these buildings stood Blair House, an elegant three-story townhouse directly across from the White House. Behind its understated facade, President Harry S. Truman was taking an afternoon nap in his second-floor bedroom. In less than 2 minutes, this quiet November day would explode into what remains the biggest gunfight in Secret Service history. Before the smoke cleared, one man would be dead on the sidewalk, another dying in his guard booth, 3 more wounded and bleeding on the street, and the President of the United States would narrowly escape assassination by pure chance. The hero of this story is a 40-year-old guard named Leslie Caulfield. Born in a small Virginia town, raised on hunting and marksmanship, he would face the most important moment of his life while mortally wounded, bleeding from multiple gunshots to his chest and abdomen. What he did next, propped against a guard booth with a revolver in his hands, would stop an assassination plot dead in its tracks and cement his place as the only member of the Secret Service ever killed defending a president. But to understand why this happened, we need to go back 2 days earlier, to a series of events that unfolded thousands of miles away on a Caribbean island, where American warplanes were dropping bombs on American soil. October 30th, 1950. The town of Jayuya sits in the mountainous interior of Puerto Rico, far from the beaches and tourist resorts. On this morning, the town square filled with armed men and women wearing black shirts. They were members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, and they had come to start a revolution. Their leader, a woman named Blanca Canales, stood before the gathering crowd and did something that would have been unthinkable just hours before. She raised the Puerto Rican flag, which at that time was illegal to display under what locals called the gag law. Then she declared Puerto Rico a free and independent republic. The nationalists attacked the local police station, overwhelmed the officers, and seized control of the town. Similar uprisings erupted across the island in places like Utuado, Ponce, Arecibo, and the capital of San Juan. The revolutionaries believed this was their moment. For decades, they had fought against what they saw as American colonialism. Their leader, a Harvard-educated lawyer named Pedro Albizu Campos, had spent years organizing, preparing, believing that armed resistance was the only path to independence. But the uprising was doomed from the start. The colonial government had informants inside the nationalist movement. Police had intercepted Albizu Campos and other leaders just days before, forcing them to launch the revolution earlier than planned. The coordination fell apart. The different uprisings couldn't support each other, and then the bombs started falling. The Puerto Rican National Guard, backed by the United States military, responded with overwhelming force. P-47, Thunderbolt fighter planes, the same aircraft that had fought in World War II, screamed over the mountains. These planes had been built in American factories, maintained with American equipment, armed with American bombs, and flown by American-trained pilots. They strafed the streets of Jayuya and Utuado with 50 caliber machine guns. They dropped 500-pound bombs. They destroyed roughly 70% of Jayuya. When the planes finally stopped, the National Guard moved in with tanks, mortars, and artillery. The nationalists held Jayuya for 3 days before being crushed. In Utuado, the story was even more brutal. 9 nationalist fighters surrendered. They were taken behind the police station and executed by machine gun fire. 5 died. 4 survived with serious wounds. The event became known as the Utuado Massacre. By November 1st, the uprising was over. Nearly 30 people were dead, hundreds were wounded, thousands were arrested. The Puerto Rican government declared martial law, and the American mainland press barely covered it. President Truman himself dismissed it as an incident between Puerto Ricans, glossing over the fact that American military aircraft had just bombed American territory for the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor. In New York City, 2 men read the news reports with growing rage. They were members of the Nationalist Party's New York chapter. They had family in Jayuya and Utuado. They had heard the real stories, the ones the American press wasn't telling, about entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, about civilians killed in the streets, about the systematic destruction of their hometown. Their names were Grisela Torresola and Oscar Collazo. And they decided that if the world wouldn't pay attention to Puerto Rico's plight, they would force it to. They would assassinate the President of the United States. Griselio Torresola was 25 years old. He had been born in Jayuya, the very town that had just been bombed into submission. His brother and sister had participated in the uprising. His entire family believed passionately in Puerto Rican independence. They had been involved in rebellions going back generations. At 23, Torresola had moved to New York looking for work. He found a job at a stationery and perfume store, but a separation from his first wife sent him spiraling. He lost his job. He became increasingly radicalized. When he learned what had happened to his hometown, that American planes had machine-gunned nearly every rooftop, that the military had used overwhelming force against his people, something inside him snapped. He was an expert marksman, possibly the best shot in the New York Nationalist chapter. Some claimed he had worked as a bodyguard for Pedro Albizu Campos back in Puerto Rico. Whether that was true or not, one thing was certain. Griselio Torresola knew how to handle weapons. His partner, Oscar Collazo, was 36 years old and knew almost nothing about guns. Born on a farm in Puerto Rico, he was the youngest of 14 children. When he was 4, his father sold the family farm and died shortly after. The family lost everything. Collazo grew up working in his brother's general store, directionless and struggling. Everything changed in April 1932 when Collazo was 18. He found himself in a public square in San Juan, listening to a speech by Pedro Albizu Campos. The nationalist leader was a compelling orator who argued that Puerto Rico's incorporation into the United States was illegal, exploitative, and driven by financial interests. Collazo was electrified. He joined the Nationalist Party that day. By 1950, he was living in the Bronx, working odd jobs, raising a family, and becoming increasingly frustrated with Puerto Rico's colonial status. When he heard about the October 30th uprising and the brutal American response, he agreed with Torresola that something dramatic had to be done. They would kill President Truman. The act would draw international attention to Puerto Rico. The world would finally see what was happening on the island. It was a suicide mission, and both men knew it. They accepted that they would likely die, but they believed the sacrifice would be worth it if it brought Puerto Rican independence one step closer. On October 30th, the day the uprisings began, Collazo and Torresola boarded a train from New York to Washington, D.C. They carried 2 pistols, a German Luger and a Walther P-38. They had a few spare magazines. That morning, before leaving New York, Torresola gave Collazo some quick instruction on how to use the P-38. It wasn't much. Collazo had barely ever fired a gun, but they were out of time. The train pulled into Washington on November 1st. They checked into a cheap hotel called the Harris. They spent the morning conducting surveillance on Blair House, watching the guards, studying the layout, looking for weaknesses. The security looked minimal. There were 2 guard booths on the sidewalk, one on each side of the main entrance. A few officers stood on the steps. It seemed manageable. What they didn't know was that the unusually warm weather had brought out more security than usual. More guards were on duty because the heat made outdoor shifts more bearable. It was pure chance, but it would prove critical in the next few minutes. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, Collazo and Torresola took a taxi to 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. The cab driver later remembered that his 2 passengers spoke to each other in Spanish during the ride. The only English word he recognized was Truman. They tipped well and seemed very polite. When they stepped out of the taxi, they split up and approached Blair House from opposite directions. Inside Blair House, President Truman had just finished lunch. He was scheduled to appear at Arlington National Cemetery later that afternoon for a ceremony honoring Field Marshal Sir John Dill, a British military leader who had worked closely with American forces during World War II. But first, Truman wanted a nap. It had been a long morning. He went upstairs to his bedroom, changed into his underwear, and lay down. The guards outside were in the middle of a shift rotation. Officer Donald Birdsell stood at the base of the main entrance steps, dressed in civilian clothes. To the left of the entrance, Officer Joseph Davidson manned one guard booth. To the right, Officer Leslie Caulfield sat in another guard booth. Behind Caulfield's position, Officer Joseph Downs stood near the basement entrance. Secret Service agents Floyd Boring and Vincent Mraz patrolled the perimeter. Inside, Agent Stuart Stout had access to a Thompson submachine gun locked in a cabinet. Leslie Caulfield was 40 years old. He had been born on August 15, 1910, in Oronda, Virginia, a small town in the Shenandoah Valley. His father was Will Koffel, his mother Effie Keller. He had 4 siblings, Harry, Hollis, Norman, and Mildred. As a boy, people called him Etz because his younger sister couldn't pronounce Leslie. He grew up hunting in the Virginia mountains. Firearms were part of everyday life in rural Virginia. By the time he was a teenager, people who knew him described him as an expert sharpshooter. He was the second person in his family to graduate from high school, which was a significant achievement for a farming family in that era. In 1928, at age 18, Koffel left Oronda and moved to Washington, D.C. looking for work. The next year, he joined the Metropolitan Police Department and was assigned to Precinct 3, which covered K Street. He worked as a regular patrol officer for 7 years, before resigning in 1936 to become a building technician. But police work was in his blood. In 1941, he returned to the Metropolitan Police. In 1942, Koffel requested and was granted a transfer to the White House Police Force, an elite unit responsible for protecting the president. That same year, World War II came calling. Koffel was drafted into the United States Army and assigned to B Company, 300th Infantry Regiment. He never made it overseas. The Army gave him a medical discharge after less than 2 years of service. In 1945, Koffel returned to the White House Police. He was married to Cressy Eleanor Morgan, a woman from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, who had trained as a nurse. She had a daughter from a previous relationship named Cora Jane Wilson. Koffel raised her as his own. He was described by everyone who knew him as a quiet, dedicated professional. He was also a Mason, a member of that fraternal organization. By November 1st, 1950, Leslie Koffel had been protecting presidents for 8 years. He had survived a world war and a medical discharge. He had built a quiet life with his wife and stepdaughter. And on this warm November afternoon, he sat in his guard booth watching tourists walk by, probably thinking about nothing more than getting through his shift and going home. At approximately 2:20 p.m., everything changed. Oscar Collazo approached from the east, walking casually along the sidewalk. He passed the guard booth manned by Officer Davidson without incident. As he neared the main entrance steps, he slipped a Walther P-38 from his waistband. Officer Birdsell stood at the base of the steps with his back turned. Collazo raised the pistol, aimed at Birdsell's back, and pulled the trigger. Click. The gun didn't fire. In his inexperience, Collazo had forgotten to chamber a round. The clicking sound made Birdsell turn around. He saw Collazo frantically working the slide, chambering a bullet. Birdsell started to draw his revolver. Too late. The P-38 fired. The bullet caught Birdsell in his right knee. He went down, scrambling backward across Pennsylvania Avenue, trying to put distance between himself and the shooter. Despite being shot in the knee, Birdsell managed to draw his service revolver and began returning fire while limping into the street. Officer Davidson, in the Eastern Guard booth, heard the shot and immediately drew his weapon. He fired 6 rounds at Collazo, but missed every shot. Secret Service agent Floyd Boring, who had been inside the booth making a phone call to headquarters, rushed out with his Colt Detective Special and fired at Collazo's head. The bullet grazed Collazo, drawing blood but not stopping him. Collazo started climbing the entrance steps. He fired 8 more shots wildly. Most missed. One hit the door frame. Another shattered a basement window. He was an amateur with a gun, firing without aim, more dangerous by accident than by skill. But he kept moving forward, trying to reach the door, trying to get inside to kill the president. While this firefight erupted at the main entrance, something far more deadly was happening on the other side of the building. Griselio Torresola had approached from the west with the calm confidence of an expert. He walked straight to the guard booth where Leslie Koffel sat. Some accounts suggest Torresola called out loudly to the guards, creating a distraction. Others say he simply appeared at the booth without warning. What happened next took maybe 3 seconds. Torresola pulled out a 9mm Luger pistol and fired 4 shots at point-blank range into the guard booth. 3 bullets struck Leslie Koffel. One hit him in the chest, another hit him in the abdomen, a third tore through his torso. The 4th bullet, by some miracle, only passed through his uniform tunic without hitting flesh. Koffel sank back into his chair inside the booth. Blood poured from his wounds. His chest had been shredded. His abdomen was torn open. These were mortal wounds. He had seconds, maybe minutes to live. Torresola didn't stop. He moved with brutal efficiency. Officer Joseph Downs stood at the basement entrance, just behind Coffelt's guard booth. He heard the shots and turned, reaching for his service revolver. Torresola shot him before the gun cleared the holster. One bullet hit Downs in the hip. As Downs twisted from the impact, Torresola shot him again in the back, then once more in the neck. 3 shots, 3 hits. Downs, despite being hit 3 times, managed to stumble through the basement door and lock it behind him. He had just enough strength to deny Torresola entry. Then he collapsed inside. Torresola turned his attention to the chaos at the main entrance. He saw Officer Birdsell in the street, wounded but still shooting at Colazzo. Torresola aimed carefully and fired. The bullet hit Birdsell in the left knee. Now the officer had been shot in both knees. He collapsed completely, unable to stand, effectively removed from the fight. The gunfight involving Torresola had lasted approximately 20 seconds. In that time, he had fired 11 rounds and hit 4 men, wounding 3 critically and killing 1. Every shot had been precise. Every movement had been calculated. This was a man who knew what he was doing. Torresola walked to the left of the Blair House steps. He had used all his ammunition. He needed to reload. He pulled out a spare magazine and began the practiced motion of dropping the empty mag and inserting a fresh one. He stood about 30 feet from the main entrance. That's when President Truman appeared at his second-floor window. Truman had been awakened by the gunfire. Still in his underwear, he went to the window to see what was happening. He pushed it open and stuck his head out. Later, he would claim that his instinct from World War I had kicked in, that he had been shot at by German professionals and wasn't particularly worried. But in that moment, Harry Truman, President of the United States, was standing in an open window just 31 feet from an armed assassin. Secret Service agents saw him immediately. They started shouting, "Get back! Get away from the window! Get down!" Truman, to his credit, ducked back inside. If Torresola had looked up 1 second earlier, if he hadn't been focused on reloading, if the timing had been slightly different, American history would have taken a very different turn. But Torresola didn't see him. He was focused on his magazine, on getting back into the fight, on pushing forward to complete the mission. Inside the Western Guard booth, Leslie Coffelt was dying. Blood soaked his uniform. His breathing was shallow. The pain must have been excruciating. By all rights, he should have been unconscious already. The wounds to his chest and abdomen were catastrophic. No one would have blamed him for staying down, for waiting for help, for simply accepting that he had done all he could. Instead, Leslie Coffelt made a choice. He gripped his .38 caliber service revolver. He pulled himself out of the chair. He staggered to the entrance of the guard booth. His legs barely held him. He propped himself against the side of the booth, using it to steady his aim. He raised his revolver. Torresola stood approximately 30 feet away, still focused on reloading his Luger. He was standing to the left of the main entrance steps, his back partially turned. Coffelt aimed. His vision must have been blurring. His hands must have been shaking. Blood continued to pour from his wounds. He had one chance, one shot. If he missed, Torresola would complete his reload, turn toward the door, and there would be nothing stopping him from getting inside. Coffelt fired. The bullet hit Griselio Torresola 2 inches above his right ear. It went straight through his brain. He was dead before he hit the ground. Leslie Coffelt lowered his revolver. He limped back into the guard booth. He collapsed into his chair. Then he blacked out. The entire gunfight, from Colazzo's first shot to Coffelt's last, had lasted less than 40 seconds. Approximately 30 rounds had been fired. The sidewalk in front of Blair House was scarred with bullet impacts. Blood pooled on the concrete. 2 men lay on the ground. 3 others were wounded, and 1 man was dying. Secret Service agent Vincent Meraz had already taken down Oscar Colazzo. After Colazzo started climbing the steps, Meraz had burst out of the basement on the east side of the building and fired, hitting Colazzo in the chest. 2 other officers also shot him. Colazzo collapsed on the steps, wounded but alive. Agent Stuart Stout stood inside the door with his Thompson submachine gun ready. If anyone had made it past the outer defenses, they would have been met with .45 caliber bullets, but no one got that far. The attack was over. An ambulance arrived within minutes. Leslie Coffelt was loaded onto a stretcher. He was still unconscious, still bleeding heavily. A civilian bystander named Elroy Seitz helped lift him into the ambulance. Coffelt was rushed to George Washington University Hospital. Officers Birdsell and Downs were also transported to the hospital. Both were in serious condition, but both would survive. Birdsell had been shot in both knees. The damage was significant, but doctors saved his legs. Downs had been hit 3 times, including in the neck. It was a miracle he was alive at all. He would spend weeks in the hospital recovering. Oscar Collazo, shot in the chest and head, was taken into custody and also transported to the hospital. Against all odds, he would survive his injuries. Gracilio Torresola was dead at the scene. His body was left on the sidewalk for the investigators and photographers. When they searched his corpse, they found a letter from Pedro Albizu Campos. It read, "My dear Gracilio, if for any reason it should be necessary for you to assume the leadership of the movement in the United States, you will do so without hesitation of any kind. We are leaving to your high sense of patriotism and sane judgment everything regarding this matter. Cordially yours." The letter confirmed what investigators already suspected. This wasn't a random act. This was a political assassination attempt, connected to the uprising in Puerto Rico. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save Leslie Caulfield. They opened him up and saw the damage. The bullets had torn through vital organs. There was massive internal bleeding. They did everything they could, but some wounds are simply beyond repair. 4 hours after the shooting, at approximately 6:20 p.m., Leslie Caulfield died. He left behind his wife, Cressy, and his stepdaughter, Cora Jane. He was 40 years old. He had served his country in war and in peace. And in the final moment of his life, mortally wounded and in unimaginable pain, he had done his duty. One shot, one kill, one assassination plot stopped cold. President Truman was shaken by Caulfield's death. About 15 minutes after the shooting, Press Secretary Charles Ross went to Blair House to ask the president if he still wanted to attend the Arlington ceremony. Truman's response was immediate. Why, certainly. He got dressed, walked out the front door of Blair House where the blood was still being scrubbed from the sidewalk, got into his motorcade, and went to Arlington National Cemetery. At the ceremony, he unveiled a monument and gave his scheduled remarks as if nothing had happened. Later, he would say he felt sick about Caulfield's death. In a letter to Secretary of State Dean Acheson dated November 2nd, Truman wrote, "It was a most unnecessary happening over there at the Blair House, and the people who really got hurt were wonderful men. The 2 men who did the job were just as stupid as they could be. I know I could organize a better program than the one they put on. They came nowhere near their objective. One of them faces the gallows and the other one is dead, although they did injure 2 good guards and kill another one unnecessarily." Truman's reaction revealed his World War I combat experience. He had been shot at by German soldiers on the Western Front. By his estimation, Collazo and Torresola were amateurs compared to professional military threats. But he was genuinely upset about the toll on his guards. These were men he saw every day, men he knew by name. Caulfield's death hit him hard. The day after the assassination attempt, Truman took his usual morning walk through Washington, D.C. with his Secret Service detail. He walked down Pennsylvania Avenue with his cane, past the White House, refusing to change his routine. He was sending a message. Assassins wouldn't change how he lived his life. Leslie Caulfield's funeral was held on November 4, 1950, at Arlington National Cemetery. It was a massive affair. President Truman and First Lady Bess Truman attended personally. So did dozens of government officials, military officers, and fellow guards. The funeral procession included a horse-drawn caisson bearing Caulfield's flag-draped coffin. Pallbearers in full-dress uniform carried him to his final resting place in Section 17, Site 177-59. His grave marker reads, "White House policeman, who gave his life in defense of the President of the United States during an assassination attempt at the Blair House, Washington, D.C." President Truman also made a point of honoring the surviving guards. He personally decorated officers Birdsell, Downs, and Davidson, along with Secret Service agents Boring and Mraz. They received commendations for their bravery. Truman also invited Cressy Caulfield to the ceremony and made sure she was recognized. In an extraordinary gesture, both President Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson asked Cressy to travel to Puerto Rico. They wanted her to receive condolences from Puerto Rican leaders and to help calm the growing anti-Puerto Rican sentiment that was sweeping the United States. Cressy agreed. She went to Puerto Rico and gave a speech absolving the Puerto Rican people of blame for the actions of Collazo and Torresola. It was an act of grace that helped prevent the situation from escalating into broader ethnic hatred. Oscar Collazo was put on trial in federal court. The trial began on February 26, 1951, with Judge T. Allen Goldsboro presiding. Collazo was charged on 4 counts, including the murder of Leslie Cauffault and the attempted murder of officers Birdsell and Downs. During the trial, Collazo claimed that the attack was not actually an assassination attempt, but a demonstration designed to shock Americans into granting Puerto Rican independence. He insisted that he and Torresola did not intend to kill anyone, but then he also admitted that Pedro Albizu Campos had ordered them to kill Truman. His testimony was contradictory and unconvincing. On March 7, 1951, the jury found Oscar Collazo guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death by electric chair. Collazo actually looked forward to martyrdom. He wanted to die for the cause. He believed his execution would galvanize the independence movement. But on July 24, 1952, President Truman did something unexpected. He commuted Collazo's death sentence to life in prison. Truman's reasoning was straightforward. Collazo had not personally killed anyone. The only man who died, Leslie Cauffault, had been killed by Torresola. By law, Puerto Rico did not have capital punishment at the time. Truman felt that executing Collazo would be inconsistent with Puerto Rican legal traditions. Collazo was furious. He didn't want mercy. He wanted to be executed so he could become a martyr. Instead, he was sent to Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas, where he would spend the next 27 years. In prison, Collazo gave interviews about his devotion to the Nationalist Party and the cause of Puerto Rican independence. He spoke about the 1932 speech by Pedro Albizu Campos that had changed his life. He defended his actions as patriotic resistance against American imperialism. He never expressed regret for the attempt, only regret that it had failed. Meanwhile, the political fallout continued. In Puerto Rico, the government arrested thousands of people suspected of supporting independence. Law enforcement used the uprising and assassination attempt as justification for a massive crackdown. Anyone with nationalist sympathies faced harassment, job loss, or imprisonment. Pedro Albizu Campos was arrested and sent back to federal prison. He had already spent 10 years in prison for conspiracy to overthrow the American government. This time, he would remain imprisoned or hospitalized until his death in 1965. The Nationalist Party was effectively destroyed as a political force. President Truman, to his credit, recognized that the underlying issue of Puerto Rico's political status needed to be addressed. In 1952, he supported a plebiscite allowing Puerto Ricans to vote on a new constitution. The vote asked whether Puerto Rico should continue as a free associated state, the designation that had been established in 1950. The result was overwhelming. 81.9% voted in favor of maintaining that status. Critics of the referendum argued that the vote was held under duress, that thousands of independent supporters were in jail, that the military crackdown had intimidated the population. Others pointed out that the status of free associated state was essentially a continuation of colonial rule under a different name. The debate continues to this day. For Leslie Cauffault, there would be no more debates. His sacrifice was recognized immediately and has been honored ever since. Inside Blair House, a plaque was installed commemorating his heroism. The day room for the U.S. Secret Service's Uniform Division at Blair House is named the Cauffault Room in his honor. The Secret Service Office of Training established the Leslie Cauffault Marksmanship Award, given to graduating recruits with the highest average score for all courses of fire. It's one of the most prestigious awards a new agent can receive, and it serves as a constant reminder of what Cauffault did on that November day. To this day, Leslie Cauffault remains the only member of the Secret Service ever killed in the line of duty while defending a president. 3 other Secret Service members have taken bullets for the president. Officers Donald Birdsell and Joseph Downs were both wounded in the same incident that killed Cauffault. Agent Tim McCarthy was wounded in the abdomen during John Hinckley's attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan in 1981, but only Cauffault paid the ultimate price. The 1950 assassination attempt had lasting effects on presidential security. Congress enacted permanent legislation authorizing Secret Service protection for the president, the immediate family, and the vice president. Before this, protection had been somewhat informal and underfunded. After November 1st, 1950, it became a serious federal mandate. The incident also revealed weaknesses in Blair House's security. The building was essentially unfortified. It sat directly on Pennsylvania Avenue with only a low iron fence. The guard booths were small wooden structures that offered minimal protection. Anyone with a gun could walk right up to the entrance. That would change. Security was dramatically enhanced, though even today, Blair House remains more vulnerable than the White House. Years later, the White House underwent another security crisis when an intruder reached the room where Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee was staying in September 2000. The Prime Minister wasn't present at the time, but the breach highlighted ongoing concerns about protecting foreign dignitaries at Blair House. For the Caulfield family, Leslie's sacrifice became a source of both pride and pain. Cressy Caulfield never remarried. She lived until 1985 and was buried next to her husband at Arlington National Cemetery. Their graves sit together in Section 17, eternal reminders of duty and sacrifice. For decades, Leslie Caulfield's extended family didn't even know about their connection to him. It wasn't until 2005 that a distant cousin named Lee Caulfield, who worked at Mount Weather, a government command facility, was checking in at work when a security officer noticed his last name. The officer, a former member of the Secret Service Uniform Division, asked if Lee was related to Leslie Caulfield. Lee had no idea who Leslie Caulfield was. The officer told him the story, and Lee went home and started researching. He discovered that his grandfather was Leslie Caulfield's cousin. The family hired a genealogist to confirm the connection. When they verified it, everything changed for the Caulfield family. They started attending annual ceremonies at Blair House and Arlington National Cemetery to honor Leslie. For a family that had a strong tradition of military and public service, discovering their connection to this heroic figure was deeply meaningful. Lee's daughter joined the United States Air Force. Other family members served in various capacities. The legacy of service continued. In 2020, on the 70th anniversary of the assassination attempt, the Secret Service held a special ceremony at Blair House. It began at 6:30 in the morning. Approximately 35 to 50 uniformed Secret Service officers stood at attention. The director of the Secret Service gave remarks about what Leslie Caulfield meant to the agency, how he exemplified what it takes to be a Secret Service officer, the willingness to give your life to protect the president. Taps was played, wreaths were laid. The Caulfield family was presented with a flag that had been flown over Blair House in Leslie's memory. These ceremonies continue to this day, ensuring that Leslie Caulfield's sacrifice is never forgotten. As for Grisilio Torresola, his body was returned to Puerto Rico and buried in the municipal cemetery in Jayuya, his hometown. To some, he remains a villain, a would-be assassin who got what he deserved. To others, particularly those in the Puerto Rican independence movement, he is considered a hero, a patriot who gave his life fighting. American colonialism. Oscar Collazo served 27 years in Leavenworth Federal Prison. During that time, his wife Rosa was also arrested on suspicion of conspiracy. She spent 8 months in federal prison without being charged or tried. After her release, she continued working with the Nationalist Party and helped gather 100,000 signatures in an effort to save her husband from execution. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted Collazo's sentence to time served. Carter believed that 27 years in prison was sufficient punishment. He also recognized that Puerto Rico's colonial status remained a deeply contentious issue, and that healing required mercy as well as justice. Collazo was released and immediately returned to Puerto Rico. He continued his activism for independence until his death in '94 at the age of 80. In his final interview, he said, "It would not be justice to Grisilio if we merely remembered him for his ability with weapons. We must remember the brave and expert guerrilla of the mountains of Jayuya as the patriot who never had doubts when his country called him to completion of his duty." To the end, Collazo never expressed remorse for the assassination attempt, only for its failure. The question of Puerto Rico's status remains unresolved. In 1952, voters approved the Free Associated State designation, but subsequent referendums in 1967, 1993, 1998, 2012, 2017, and 20 have produced mixed results, with various levels of support for statehood, independence, and enhanced Commonwealth status. The island's relationship with the United States continues to be complicated, shaped by economics, politics, history, and the scars left by events like the 1950 uprising and bombing. The Jayuya uprising itself has become a symbol for both sides of the debate. Pro-independence activists view it as a heroic resistance against colonialism. Those who support Puerto Rico's continued relationship with the United States see it as a violent and futile rebellion that only brought suffering. The truth, as always, is more complex than either side wants to admit. What cannot be debated is what happened on November 1st, 1950 at Blair House. Two armed men attempted to kill the President of the United States. A gunfight erupted on Pennsylvania Avenue in broad daylight. 3 guards were shot and wounded. One guard, Leslie Caufelt, was mortally wounded by multiple gunshots to his chest and abdomen. And in the final seconds of his life, propped against a guard booth with blood pouring from his wounds, Leslie Caufelt raised his service revolver one last time. He aimed at the man who had just shot him. He steadied his hands, and he fired a single shot that hit Griselio Torresola in the head, killing him instantly. Then Caufelt limped back to his booth and collapsed. 4 hours later, he was dead. 1 shot, 1 kill, 1 duty fulfilled. Harry Truman would later say that assassins are just stupid people who never come close to their objectives. But on November 1st, 1950, the assassins came very close indeed. If Torresola had looked up 1 second earlier and seen Truman at the window, if Caufelt had been unable to take that final shot, if the timing had been even slightly different, the 33rd President of the United States might have been killed. But Leslie Caufelt made sure that didn't happen. Even as his life drained away, even as the pain must have been unbearable, he did his job. He protected the president. He stopped the threat. He saved Harry Truman's life. The Secret Service has a motto, worthy of trust and confidence. Every agent who joins the service learns about Leslie Caufelt. They learn about the guard who was shot 3 times, but still found the strength to take down an assassin from 30 feet away with a single, perfect shot. They learn about the ultimate sacrifice, about duty that extends beyond survival, about what it means to be worthy of trust and confidence. Leslie Caufelt's story is a reminder that heroism doesn't always come with advance notice. He woke up that morning expecting a routine shift. He probably thought about what he would have for lunch, whether he needed to pick up anything on the way home, when his next day off would be. He had no idea that by the end of the day, his name would be in every newspaper in America. He didn't ask for the opportunity to be a hero. The opportunity came to him in the worst possible way, and he rose to meet it. Today, if you visit Arlington National Cemetery, you can find Leslie Caufelt's grave in Section 17. The headstone is simple, dignified, marked with his service dates and a brief description of how he died. Next to him is his wife Cressy, who was buried there in 1985. Every year, on the anniversary of the assassination attempt, the Secret Service holds a ceremony. Agents gather in the early morning darkness at Blair House. They stand at attention. They remember one of their own who gave everything. And somewhere, in a small Shenandoah Valley town called Aranda, there are probably still people who remember a quiet boy called Etz, who grew up hunting in the mountains, who became an expert marksman, who moved to the city to make something of himself, who found a calling in service, and who died protecting his president. Leslie Caufelt never became famous. His name doesn't appear in most history books. When people think about presidential assassination attempts, they usually think of Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Kennedy, Reagan. The 1950 attempt on Truman's life is largely forgotten by the general public. But the Secret Service remembers, the Uniform Division remembers, and they make sure that every new recruit learns about the guard in the booth, who took 3 bullets to the chest, propped himself up against a wall, and fired the shot that saved a president's life. That is the legacy of Leslie William Caufelt. Expert sharpshooter, White House police officer, Mason, husband, stepfather, hero. He was shot 3 times protecting Truman. Then he killed the assassin with his last bullet, and then he died, knowing he had done his duty.